So those who've just tuned in to this episode of the Retired Student Podcast are going to listen to you, and I know what the result is going to be. They're going to go out and sign up for yoga if they already aren't a yoga fan. So they may be listening because they already love you and they love yoga, and they already know about you and your prowess within yoga. And if they don't do yoga, I'm hoping that they go dive into this. So what is it going to cost? If you're going to do yoga twice a week, 3 times a week, what's it going to cost you?
Well, like many answers to many of the questions you're going to ask me, Wes, I'm going to say it depends. It can be free. There's a lot of yoga out there on the internet, and people have discovered that, particularly during the pandemic, and it can be free. The cost of that is that there's some really good yoga on the internet, and there's some really terrible yoga on the internet, so people could get hurt. So that's not a monetary cost. So it could be free. Realistically, if you're talking about a class, joining a class, say at a senior center, since we're talking about senior yoga, sometimes those classes are free, but very often it's a nominal cost. So we're talking $5, $10 a class. So a relatively modest fee. The classes that I was teaching at Duke Integrative Medicine were a $10 drop-in fee. So that's a pretty modest cost.
Yeah.
And that's for a group class. Something that people are becoming more and more interested, and I've actually had a very big uptake in participants in yoga therapy since the pandemic. So yoga therapy is a one-on-one session with a trained yoga therapist. So it's a private class. And that can range anywhere, it's probably about $100 an hour.
So let's go back to when you started this, because you've been doing yoga for 50, almost like, a half a century, right? 50 years.
Yeah, there you go. I turned 68 last week, and I've been practicing since my early 20s, so you do the math.
Yeah, almost 50 years of yoga. But
that's right.
Let's go back to that. How popular was yoga back then, and then how did you get started with it?
Well, back then, when I was in my early...
As my kids always say, Carol, back in the day, Dad, when you
Back
were
in the
a kid.
day. Well, I'll tell you how old I am, Wes. I was back in the day in my early 20s. I was a brand new reporter at the Washington Post, and this was the heyday of journalism. Ben Bradley was my editor. Catherine Graham was the publisher. I was a 20-something wearing a power suit and high heels and trying to get articles on the front page. When I started the Post, we used typewriters.
Yeah.
And then the first year I was at the Post, we converted to computers. And those early computers had no ergonomic sensibility. So I was slamming out, articles on deadline, and I got terrible neck pain. This is how I started yoga. So I was very stressed. I loved my job. It was fantastic, but it was quite stressful. And I also developed really severe neck pain from typing on these little fixed keyboard computers. At the time, I was extremely active. I still am. I was a runner. I was a dancer. And I thought, well, maybe this yoga thing is going to help me stretch because my legs were very tight from running. And for the first 20 years of my yoga life, I went to one class a week. And that weekly yoga class was an oasis in my very stressful life. It was a fantastic and wonderful. I loved my 10 years as a reporter and editor at the Washington Post. When we moved to North Carolina, my husband's a cardiologist and he got a job at Duke, so we moved and I kept writing a column for the Post, but I'd just go to that weekly yoga class. And after a time, it kind of sunk in that, there's a whole lot more to this practice than the physical, because I would come in with being very wound up, and when I finished the practice, I was calm, and I slept great, and I felt great, and that's sort of how I got into yoga.
So, Carol, can we? Let me think about this for a minute. If I go into, and this is, I guess, the great thing about exercise in general, is I feel the positive impact for a day or two on the stress relief side. I've only done a few yoga classes in my life, and I do remember feeling good afterwards, and I was really glad I did it, and then I never have restarted. It's always one of those things on my list that I'd like to go back to because I had a positive experience with it. But how long is it like when you go for a run and that you kind of feel good for the next day? What's the residual of the benefits from a yoga session?
Well, yoga is much more than a workout. So in the West, we think about our bodies as our physical bodies and our muscles and our bones and our joints. In yoga, the yoga understanding of the human body is that we are a many layered organism. The physical body is just the outer layer. Then there's the energetic bodies, there's the bodies of thoughts and emotion. So to answer your question, yoga touches into all these different aspects of ourselves. So it's much more than just the physical self. And yeah, when we go for a run, we get the endorphins going. We have that runner's high, and there can be some of that in yoga. Yoga also touches into our energies. If we're really wound up, it can calm us down. If we're a little too down, it can rev us up. And it helps us get in touch with any emotions that might be there. Sometimes in our culture, we tend to sort of stuff down our feelings. Yoga can help us get in touch with what's really going on. The word yoga means union, and it's a union of many things. It's a union of your mind and your body through your breath. And it's also a union of the individual with that sense of something bigger and something greater. So the yoga high, if you would, if can last can last for a lifetime if you take the practice off the mat into your daily life.
How much of yoga? So again, meditation is how much of meditation is within yoga, or can they be together, or are they totally separate?
That's a really good question. Meditation is one of the tools in the Hatha Yoga toolkit. So when we talk about yoga in the West, we're talking about something called Hatha Yoga, which is the path of yoga that's using the physical body to touch into a sense of, well, enlightenment, if you will. And the Hatha Yoga practice has four main tools. So the postures, when we think about doing yoga, most people think about poses. Well,
Sure.
I'm doing a headstand, or I'm doing a handstand, or I'm doing warrior pose. Now I'm doing yoga. Now the poses are just one little piece. So that's one of the tools. I said there were four. One of the tools is posture. The next tool would be breathing. So how we use the breath, becoming aware of the breath, skillful use of the breath. And then the next tool I would say would be meditation. So meditation is a part of the yoga practice. And the fourth tool in the yoga toolkit are principles. And this really gets short shrift, I think, in the West. People don't really think about it. But in yoga, it's not just what you do, but how you do it. So it's approaching the practice with a sense of self-compassion and kindness, non-judgmental, gratitude. All of these attitudes that we have on the mat, if we bring these into our daily life, that yoga high, that yoga feeling can last a lifetime.
It's funny when I said that our listeners would be rushing out to do yoga after listening to you, I didn't realize it would happen in like the first 7 minutes because I'm ready to go do a yoga class right now. Carol, where do we find? You had mentioned that we could obviously find yoga on YouTube and we could just practice at home. The cost of that, obviously, it's there's no monetary cost, but then you could easily find, let's say, a class or some sort of instructor that isn't really that good. How do we know, let's say we're headed out to the world to go find yoga. How do we know what's good or not good? And are most classes, if we find a place out, someone that's actually doing this for a living, or most of those, you have a high probability that you're going to get a good yoga experience relative to just picking a popular YouTube video?
It's really, really important to study with a qualified, skilled instructor, particularly if you're talking about someone who has any kind of health challenges, an older adult. This is what I've devoted the last 2 decades of my life to, is making yoga practice accessible and available to seniors, because many of the movements, the postures that are commonly taught in yoga classes can be risky for adults, for older adults. So, say straight-legged forward bends, or something that you see in classes all the time. The sun salutation. One of the moves is you're standing up and you sweep your arms out and you bend over and you reach your hands in the direction of the floor, keeping your legs straight. And this is a very common yoga practice. I used to do this all the time. It's called Uttanasana, standing forward fold. If someone has low bone density, which I do, being a 68-year-old postmenopausal white female, that puts me at risk for vertebral fracture.
Ooh.
So this is not something I practice anymore. This is not something I teach anymore. And if you go to any physical therapist and you say, well, I'm going to bend over and touch my toes, they'll tell you, bend your knees. Bend your knees. But in yoga, somehow this has become a sacred move, and it's not appropriate for older adults. So
okay, so you've modified. So Carol, you've really helped as you've gone. You've been doing this since you're 20. So I picture you like running around Metropolis like Lois Lane.
In my high heels.
You get all stressed out. You start yoga. You're in your 20s, so you're not worried about your vertebrae.
I did all of that nonsense in my 20s. I stood on my head.
And then, but then you've modified this for those who would be, say, let's say 60 and up, when we get a little less flexible. So you've really taken on the challenge of how do we do this for seniors, essentially.
Exactly. So with a colleague of mine, Kimberly Carson, she and I at Duke Integrative Medicine, where I'm the yoga therapist, we created a yoga teacher training program. We started in 2007, and we brought in experts from the Duke Health Center. We brought in cardiologists to teach us about heart disease. That cardiologist is my husband, Mitch, thank you, Mitch, for being on our faculty. We brought in a physical therapist to teach us about osteoporosis, respiratory therapists to teach us about pulmonary disease. So we have a wonderful faculty of Duke experts who've taught us about these health conditions, arthritis, things that many older adults are dealing with. And then what does that mean for the yoga practice? What might we want to consider when we're doing a posture practice for somebody who might be at risk of a vertebral fracture, or who might be at risk of a heart attack? So we have made those modifications, and that's what we outline in our book, Relax into Yoga for Seniors. And we still run this teacher training. We're doing it virtually this year at Duke for yoga instructors. So to go back to your very good question about how do you find a good teacher, you want to make sure that the teacher is well trained. The basic training for yoga teachers these days, and it's become a big business to train yoga teachers, and everybody and their mother is a yoga teacher now. It's a very minimal standard, 200 hours of training. So if you have your 200 hours of training, you can have the initials RYT behind your name. That just means Registered Yoga Teacher at 200 hours. At that level, most teachers do not have any kind of in-depth understanding of aging physiology. So this is where we came in to offer our continuing education program for yoga teachers and yoga therapists. Now, yoga therapists have, in addition to that 200 hours, a minimum of 800 hours of extra training in working with people with different health conditions. So I would say you want to make sure that somebody has at minimum an RYT, and I'd want to work with somebody who has experience, who's worked with older adults, who's been with this population, who's had additional training. There are many, walk into a gym, there are many classes that are called yoga that, in my opinion, are yoga flavored exercise. They're an exercise class. They use the same mentality that you would for believe me, I love exercise classes. I've been a gym rat. If you want to do exercise, terrific. Do Zumba or some kind of a great. But if you're calling it yoga, please make sure that it's really yoga and it's not an exercise class where you're doing yoga postures. And I have a whole rant on that. If you go to the Huffington Post and Google me, you'll find, is it yoga or yoga flavored exercise?
I love yoga flavored exercise. I love it.
Right.
So Carol, so I know you had mentioned hatha yoga, which is in the West here in America. That's a kind of the dominant strain, if you will.
Correct.
What are the other big, let's say, sectors of the yoga world around the world, and what are kind of the
So,
other ones that get practiced either here in the United States or in Europe, et cetera?
well, hatha yoga, the anything that does physical postures and physical poses is going to be hatha yoga. There are other kinds of yoga. So bhakti yoga is the yoga of devotion. So someone who you might see in India, you see a lot of bhakti yogis. They'll be putting flower garlands around statues of deities and incense. And bhakti yoga is the yoga of devotion. Karma yoga is the yoga of action. So someone who does a lot of selfless service, you might say Mother Teresa was a karma yogi, practicing that sort of devoting yourself and your life to serving others. That would be karma yoga. Jnana yoga is the yoga of wisdom. So people who study the texts, that would be jnana yoga. And let's see, what am I leaving out? Tantra yoga is a yoga of ceremony. So those are the other kinds of yoga. But any form of yoga that involves physical poses and practices is hatha yoga.
Okay, so that is, and we've got several folks here on the Retire Sooner team that practice yoga and some meditation, and I'm like behind the eight ball on doing all this, which I feel like I certainly would love to do this again or try this again. But what do you see? I mean, there's such passion behind this. The folks that here, like Mallory, Elizabeth, Andrea, that do yoga, they're kind of addicted to it. It doesn't seem like an unhealthy addiction because it's something that it's not like they're doing this 3 or 4 times a day. But let's just talk about the benefits for at any age, and then maybe even more so for folks who are getting into retirement. And are they a little bit different? Are they similar between different ages? Talk to me about the fruits of your yoga labor.
Well, the benefits of yoga are really vast. So, on a physical level, that outer layer, on a physical level, you get all the benefits of a physical activity. So, it can strengthen your any weak muscles, it can stretch any tight muscles, so you enhance your flexibility, you enhance your balance, so that particularly as you get older, reducing your risk of falls can be really huge. Depending on the type of yoga you're doing, you can also boost your cardiovascular system, and of course, the breathing that's involved can be really huge. So, on a physical level, you are meeting the U.S. Surgeon General's recommendations of getting a minimum of 30 minutes of moderate activity most days of the week. So that
Okay,
has
so
all
it counts. So it counts
it counts.
as exercise. When you
It does.
see,
It counts as exercise.
got it. Okay.
It is considered a moderate level exercise, so it really it counts. That said, if somebody has particular cardiovascular issues and they're looking for maximum cardiovascular fitness, I would not rely just on yoga for cardiovascular fitness. So personally, I take my dog for a 3-mile walk every day. So I'm walking for about 45 minutes and then I go do my yoga practice. So the combination of those two, I want to be clear and upfront that cardiovascularly, you're not going to get the same bang for the buck that you would for a good walk. And that's why I do them both. On a physical level, strength, balance, flexibility, proprioception, meaning that if you were to walk along and stumble, if you've been practicing yoga, you might not fall because you're used to challenging your balance. You're used to trying to stand on one leg. Maybe you've got the ankle flexibility because you've been practicing yoga, so you're reducing your fall risk, which can be huge as we get older.
Yeah, let's keep going. So we stopped at we have some cardio. Yeah, some cardio.
Yeah, cardio and of course musculoskeletal, all of that. It can strengthen your bones properly done. Emotionally, the yoga practice can be really huge, because what the yoga practice does is it it gets us in touch with our deepest, truest self. That is the intention. The Yoga Sutras of Patanjali say that yoga is the stilling of the fluctuations of consciousness. So that's what yoga is designed to do. It's designed to quiet your mind. For what purpose? So you can better hear the still small voice of your heart. So
Ooh.
usually we're all so busy and we're running around and we've got things on our to-do list and our phones are going off, and we're in our heads. Yoga takes us out of our head and into our body and lets us tap into the big question. Who am I? And what am I doing here? And we spend some time on the mat every day with that very intimate question, who am I and what am I doing here? And as I've grown older in my yoga practice, and my yoga practice has changed from, doing a lot of crazy party poses to a practice to keep me strong and fit enough to lift my 38-pound grandson and all the other things that I want to do. I appreciate more and more those moments of stillness and connection. Because let's face it, these bodies don't last forever. We're not here forever. We're here for whatever time is granted us, and getting connected with that deeper sense of purpose and meaning, that's what we do. And that's pretty cool.
It is. It's very cool. What about? So, are we moving? Is that part of what you've practiced over the course of your life? Which is that adaptive yoga, where you go from straight leg bend to bent leg bend to, or not doing certain poses? Is that what you call adaptive yoga?
The word adaptive yoga and accessible yoga is a relatively new term. But yes, so popularized by a very lovely, wonderful yogi named Jivana Heyman, who has a whole accessible yoga foundation or accessible yoga association online. Back in the day, it was called modify your practice. Do these modifications, often using props. So yeah, you can call that adaptive yoga, but honestly, all yoga should be adaptive yoga, because people are different. They have different needs, they have different abilities, they have different proportions. So sometimes whether or not someone can touch their hand to the floor doesn't say as much about their flexibility or their strength as the fact proportionately, like my arms are really short and my torso is really long. Mm-hmm. So that means some postures I don't look as magazine cover as somebody else who's got long arms and long legs and a short torso. And there are other postures that I really look great because of my proportion. So sometimes it's just the way we're built. And then sometimes it has to do with tightness or tension. So all yoga should be adaptive. And one of the things I try to cultivate in my classes, and I think any good teacher would, is to make it really personal. This is not competing. It doesn't matter. In group classes, I'd say, don't look at the other people on their mats. Your yoga mat is your own private island. And in this sea of yoga mats, we all have our own private islands. The other natives are friendly. Just don't bother them, and they won't bother you. And just whatever works for you is what you ought to be doing.
In your book, Relax into Yoga for Seniors, you talk about that transition of people just do either transitioning or starting later. And I guess we can start at any age, but obviously you like to champion, even if you're 60 or 70, you should be able to and can start yoga, but it's going to be different than somebody who's 25. So maybe just touch on that a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely. It is never too late to start practice. And I often would have people kind of poke their head into the class that I was teaching and say, oh, is this gentle yoga? Can I just watch? I'd like to do it. What I hear all the time, Wes, is, I'd like to do yoga, but I'm not flexible enough to do yoga. And I say, hey, That's like saying my house is too messy to hire a cleaning service. You do not have to be flexible to do yoga. The only thing you need to be able to do to practice yoga is breathe. If
Mm.
you can breathe, you're in. So I would recommend that somebody who wants to start yoga later in life do a little homework and make sure that they find an appropriate class for them. Now, when we get up into the sixth, seventh, eighth decade of life, there's a really broad range of abilities. You can
Mm.
have 60-year-olds who can't get out of bed, and you can have 80-year-olds who are running marathons.
Yeah.
So there are going to be varied classes. But that said, if someone is an older adult, just by virtue of age alone, they're at higher risk for injury, and there's good data to support this. Practicing yoga or doing any physical activity, so they really need to have a good teacher.
Speaking of, can you maybe recount a story? And I wanted to ask you what has maybe surprised you the most about teaching yoga, but maybe just a story or an anecdote of someone that you've really seen this help. Somebody who did have a messy house that didn't want to start cleaning, but did, and said, and looked back and said, "Oh my!" So, have you seen some big improvements, or?
Oh, wow. Yeah, I first started teaching yoga. I had not really intended to be a yoga teacher. I had a book come out in 2000 called Healing Moves: How to Cure, Relieve, and Prevent Common Ailments with Exercise. And there was a yoga teacher training in my neighborhood. It was a 2-year program. And I took that, and there were very few yoga teacher trainings back then, 20 years ago. I took that teacher training not because I wanted to teach yoga, but I thought it would be a good credential for my book, and I wanted
Yeah.
the experience. I wanted to learn more about yoga. So I trust I'm going to answer your question. As part of that training, I was required to do community service. So I had 12 weeks of community service that I needed to do. So I volunteered to teach yoga at the Durham VA. So that was the Veterans Administration
In Durham, North
in
Carolina.
Durham, North
Yeah.
Carolina, where I live. And so my students were men, mostly men, because it was the VA in their 60s, 70s, and 80s. And these guys had bypass surgery. They had artificial joints. One guy had shrapnel in his shoulder. Some were on oxygen. I walked into that room and I thought, I'm going to kill these guys. I don't know what to do. I was scared to death. So I watched them do their calisthenics. They were in a gerontology rehab program. So they were doing cardio and they were doing strength training, and I was going to come in once a week and teach yoga. So I watched them do their floor exercises, and they got on all fours and they did something they called hump and slump. And the light bulb went off in my head. I said, that's cat cow. We teach that in yoga. And I saw that in their calisthenics, they were doing a bunch of yoga poses. So I figured, well, they're already doing those. So I probably won't kill them if we do those. I'm just going to add the breathing and the awareness, and I'm going to put in some relaxation. So I was kind of flying by the seat of my pants. And instead of volunteering there for 12 weeks, I volunteered there for 5 years. And those guys were amazing. They came back, they would tell me that they were able to cut back on their blood pressure medication. One fellow who had been using a walker now was only using a cane. Someone else who had not been able to sleep at night was able to get to sleep at night. So it was really remarkable, and that's what led me down the path of going out to get more training and more experience for myself so I could better serve this population. But I saw a huge benefit to these guys, and that's what started me on my journey, trying to make the practice as safe and accessible to older adults as possible.
So it really became a calling for you.
It did. It did. It was not where I started. I'm a journalist and I'm writing books. And I always did yoga and physical activity as my hobby. I've been very physically active. When my kids were little, I did karate with them for 10 years, and I had a second degree black belt in karate. So I'm somebody who really loves to be active. And much of what that we did in karate, there's a real correlation because karate is also about moving energy and about connecting with your life force. In karate, we called it chi or ki. In yoga, we call it prana. So it's about connecting to your life force, moving energy. Um, Karate, of course, is a self-defense technique, and yoga is a method of reaching enlightenment. But there are similarities.
Enlightenment and defense, but I love that. I love that you're a second degree black belt. That's amazing. So
Yeah,
you're a
yeah,
black belt.
yeah. I got my black belt at 42, and my son was a teenager then, so he'd be my uki. That's the person who attacks you in a self-defense set. And
Yeah.
because he was my son and he's taller than me, he'd let me look really good and strangle him with my purse or whatever my self-defense set was.
How many hours? So, what level did have you gotten to when it comes to yoga instructor? You obviously you started with the RYT. Did you go to yoga therapist as well, or what level are you within the yoga
Yeah,
world?
so I am RYT 500. ERYT. E means experienced registered yoga teacher at the 500 level. That's as high as you can go in the Yoga Alliance, the one that registers yoga teacher, and I've been that level for decades. And then I'm also a CIAYT, that's certified yoga therapist by the International Association of Yoga Therapy. So I'm that as well.
So we can look for that. So our audience, when if we're out looking
Yes.
for yoga instructor, we can
Yes.
look for E500 as kind of really experienced in E500 or the
IAYT. Yeah.
CIAYT. Okay.
Yeah.
CIAYT.
Yeah. So that is certified yoga therapist by the International Association of Yoga Therapy.
Well, you know where I'm about to go search online right now here in Atlanta to find yoga. I really love to do this. We just have to be able to carve out time to do it. And oh, by the way, your typical yoga session, are you doing this for 45 minutes, an hour? What's your typical
So a
session?
yoga class can range. The classes that I would teach at Integrative Medicine would be 60-minute, a 1 hour class. And funny that you should mention time because the other book that I've written is called Yoga Sparks: 108 Easy Practices for Stress Relief in a Minute or Less. So if you have a minute, you can practice yoga.
108 easy practices for stress relief in a minute
In a
or
minute, and the
less.
reason that I wrote that, Wes, is that I would have a session with somebody, and I come back the next week and I'd say, well, how's your practice going? Well, this came up and that came up, and I didn't
Yeah,
have time to
yeah.
do the practice. But that thing you told me about when the phone rings, instead of jumping to answer the phone, stop and take a breath. I do that all the time. Or that thing you told me about sitting on my sit bones, I do that all the time. So I thought, okay, people, you got to start where people are. And if they
Wow.
don't have a half an hour or 20 minutes or 15 minutes to practice yoga, do they have a minute? And anybody who doesn't have a minute really needs yoga. So would you like to do a short practice right now?
Oh God, yes. God, yeah,
Okay.
absolutely.
Okay, so just freeze, don't move. And not just to keep breathing, but anybody who's listening too, just freeze for a moment and notice how you're sitting. Notice your posture. Okay, is your spine in a nice S shape like the spine should be, or are you kind of curved over? Is your head forward? Yeah, head forward. So take a minute and see if you can sit up tall on your sit bones. So those are the two knobs at the base of the pelvis. And then visualize your spine lifting up and the very top of your head lifting up toward the sky. Relax your shoulders. Good. And just take a moment here and notice your breath. And invite the breath to enter your body, breathing in and out through the nose. So see if you can keep your mouth closed. Yep. In through the nose, out through the nose. Easy breath in, and just notice all the sensations of your breath. And then when you're ready, if you've got your eyes closed, open your eyes. And you've practiced yoga.
I felt relaxed already talking to you just in general, but something about back of the neck to the sky is very relaxing for me.
Yeah, so that place at
Love
the very
that.
top of the
I love
head,
that.
that's called the crown of the head. And it's nice to imagine that as a magnet and the sky as magnetic because everything we do in our life, almost unless you're painting the ceiling and then you're doing a back bend, almost everything we do in our life puts our head forward of our shoulders. And we've got these habits, just these really habits that we've gotten into of having our head forward. And the head is really heavy. Head weighs about 10 pounds, like a bowling ball. And think if you were holding a bowling ball in front of you, how tired your arm would get. So just by balancing your head over your shoulder girdle, and you see we can see each other. I've got a little headrest, and it's there for a reason. So when I'm practicing, I can keep in good alignment. So remember I said I had neck pain. I don't have neck pain anymore.
One more question about folks that have chronic pain. I don't know if we've talked about that. I wondered about people that have that have pain issues in general. I know you've written about that as well. How do you heal that?
Yeah. So the most recent book that I wrote with my colleagues, Jim and Kimberly Carson, is a PhD psychologist, and Kimberly has her master's of public health. They're in Oregon now, but they've spent the last 2 decades studying the impact of yoga and meditation on chronic pain. And the book that we wrote together, Relax into Yoga for Chronic Pain, takes the protocol that they used in their research studies, which has suggested that yoga and meditation can be as or more effective than the most commonly prescribed medications. For the trial they used was for fibromyalgia, and the results for yoga and meditation were as good or better than I'm not sure which medication was most commonly prescribed, but the most commonly prescribed medication. So pain is a very interesting phenomenon because pain is mediated by the brain. So what the studies suggest is that our thoughts and our feelings can impact our perception of pain. And this doesn't mean that our pain isn't real or it's all in our head. Not at all. It's all in our head, not psychologically, but neurologically. So the
Yeah.
way the brain is this command center, and it's telling us what to pay attention to. And there's a very common habit that people have called catastrophizing, where the mind sort of spins into these loops of the worst that can happen. And it has been shown that people who have the habit of catastrophizing have a greater intensity of pain. So one of the ways yoga can intervene is it can help people become aware of their thoughts and their emotions and how their reactivity can be exacerbating their pain. So in yoga we work not just with the physical body, but we're training our minds and we're training our attention, what we pay attention to. So yoga and meditation can be a powerful intervention to help people who have chronic pain.
You know what? I think that you've created the first yoga moment on the Retire Sooner podcast.